February 14th, 2025. Four major South Korean banks simultaneously stopped selling silver. Not reduced inventory, not limited quantities, completely stopped, indefinitely. I kept staring at the Reuters terminal, refreshing the screen every few seconds, hoping this was some kind of translation error. KB Kookmin Bank, Shinhan Bank, Woori Bank, and Hana Bank, institutions with combined assets exceeding $2.3 trillion, had quietly removed silver from their precious metals offerings without explanation. That same day, silver hit $66.06 per ounce, all-time highs. And instead of celebration in banking circles, I found silence. Deafening, institutional silence. Here's what caught my attention. These weren't small regional banks facing liquidity issues. These were systemically important financial institutions with unlimited capital and global supply chains. If Shinhan Bank, with its $428 billion in assets, can't source enough silver to meet customer demand, what does that tell you about actual metal availability? But South Korea was just the beginning. China raised risk classifications on precious metals trading for citizens. India's silver imports hit records, while domestic banks quietly rationed supplies. Swiss refiners started demanding 90-day payment terms instead of standard 30-day settlements. Something fundamental had shifted in the global silver market, and the banking system was responding with unprecedented restrictions. I started digging deeper, and what I found was a pattern I'd seen before. The same pattern that played out in palladium in 2001, oil in 1973, and wheat during the Irish potato famine. But this time, it wasn't just commodity markets breaking down. This time, the banking system itself was admitting defeat. When banks stop selling a monetary metal, they're not protecting customers from volatility. They're protecting themselves from delivery failures. And delivery failures in precious metals have historically preceded the most violent price dislocations in financial history. The Hunt brothers learned this lesson the hard way in 1980. Two billionaire Texas oil men accumulated 200 million ounces of silver, roughly half of America's entire supply. January 1980, silver hit $49.45. Then the COMEX changed the rules. Silver crashed to $10. The Hunts were destroyed. But here's what everyone forgets. The squeeze was real. The shortage was real. The $49 price was real. It literally took changing the rules of the entire game to stop the silver market from breaking completely. Now imagine that scenario, but instead of two reckless billionaires driving demand, it's global industrial consumption. Solar panels, electric vehicles, 5D infrastructure, data centers. Every technology defining the modern economy requires silver, and we're using more than we mine for the 7th consecutive year. The math is brutal. Annual silver consumption sits around 1.1 billion ounces. Mine production peaked at 880 million ounces and hasn't grown since 2016. Above-ground stockpiles are being systematically drained to cover the 200-plus million-ounce annual deficit. COMEX registered inventories tell the story. October 2020, 400 million ounces available for delivery. Today, less than 60 million ounces. That represents just 3 weeks of global consumption sitting in the world's primary silver exchange. When South Korean banks stopped selling silver on February 14th, they weren't responding to regulatory changes or compliance issues. They were responding to a supply crisis that most investors don't even know exists yet. And this is where the pattern becomes dangerous. This isn't the first time financial institutions have quietly retreated from precious metals markets before catastrophic price moves. History shows a clear pattern. When banks and exchanges start restricting access to physical metals, violent price dislocations follow within months. Let me walk you through 3 historical cases that mirror exactly what we're seeing today. 1971. The gold window closure. August 15th, 1971. President Nixon announced the temporary suspension of gold convertibility for dollars. Temporary became permanent overnight. Foreign central banks had been demanding physical gold delivery for their dollar holdings throughout the 1960s. The United States simply didn't have enough gold to meet obligations. What happened next? Gold went from $35 per ounce in 1971 to $850 by 1980. That's a 2,328% increase in 9 years. Silver followed, rising from $1.29 to $49.45. Both metals telling the same story. When institutional access to physical metals gets restricted, prices explode. But here's the key insight most people miss. The price explosion didn't happen immediately. It took months for markets to realize the implications. Smart money used that window to accumulate physical metal while prices were still suppressed by paper promises. 2001. The palladium supply crisis. Russia controlled 60% of global palladium supply through Norilsk nickel. In early 2001, the Russian government mysteriously delayed export shipments. No official explanation, just bureaucratic delays that stretched weeks into months. Toyota, Ford, and General Motors, companies with unlimited capital, couldn't source enough palladium for catalytic converter production. These weren't speculative traders or retail investors. These were industrial giants with direct relationships to primary producers, and they couldn't get metal. The institutional panic was immediate. Palladium spot prices went from $500 per ounce in 2000 to over $1,000 by February 2001. But futures markets couldn't deliver physical metal to settle contracts. Automakers were forced to substitute platinum at massive cost and efficiency losses. The pattern was identical to what we're seeing today. Industrial demand meets constrained supply. Institutions restrict access. Physical markets decouple from paper markets. Prices detonate. 2008. The banking system freeze. September 2008. Lehman Brothers collapsed. Credit markets froze. But something else happened that most people don't remember. Precious metals dealers couldn't get financing to purchase inventory from major banks. HSBC, JP Morgan, and Deutsche Bank, the largest bullion banks in the world, quietly reduced their precious metals lending operations. Not because they lacked gold or silver, but because counterparty risk had spiked so high they couldn't trust settlement mechanisms. Physical premiums exploded overnight. American Silver Eagles that normally traded at $2 to $3 over spot suddenly cost $8 to $12 premium. Delays stretched from days to weeks to months, and this was during a deflationary crisis when most commodities were collapsing. Gold went from $720 per ounce in October 2008 to $1,921 by September 2011. Silver followed, rising from $9 to $49. Again, the pattern held. Institutional restriction of access preceded massive price appreciation. The current pattern, 2025. Now let's analyze what's happening today through this historical framework. South Korean banks didn't wake up on February 14th and decide to stop selling silver for regulatory compliance. They responded to supply constraints that made delivery promises too risky to maintain. When Shinhan Bank, with its massive balance sheet and global connections, can't reliably source silver for customers, that signals systematic supply failure. China's restrictions on precious metals purchases for citizens isn't about protecting retail investors from volatility. Beijing is hoarding strategic metals for state use while restricting private accumulation. They're preparing for supply shortages, not preventing speculation. Swiss refiners demanding 90-day payment terms instead of 30-day standards indicates financing stress in the physical market. When century-old institutions like Metalor change fundamental business practices, they're responding to unprecedented market conditions. The difference between 2025 and previous crises is scale. In 1971, only central banks were demanding physical delivery. In 2001, only a handful of industrial users faced shortages. In 2008, the crisis was primarily financial. Today, we have industrial demand explosion, monetary debasement, and systematic supply deficit occurring simultaneously. Solar panel installations require 230 million ounces annually. Electric vehicle production needs triple the silver of conventional cars. Data centers, 5G infrastructure, medical devices. Every growth sector of the economy increases silver consumption. But here's what makes this crisis different from all previous examples. The institutions restricting access aren't trying to manipulate prices higher. They're trying to avoid delivery failures that could destroy their reputations and trigger massive lawsuits. When banks stop selling silver, they're protecting themselves, not their customers. And when banks need to protect themselves from precious metals delivery obligations, that means the underlying physical shortage is far worse than public data suggests. The pattern is accelerating, and the next phase has always been the same throughout history. Explosive price discovery, as markets realize paper promises can't be converted to physical metal. The numbers tell a story banking executives understand, but won't discuss publicly. What I found was a supply deficit so severe that continued operations would guarantee delivery failures within months. The COMEX time bomb. COMEX registered silver inventories sit at 59.8 million ounces. Open interest represents claims on 244% of registered inventory. For every deliverable ounce, there are 2.44 paper contracts claiming ownership. October 2024, 113 million ounces. Today, 59.8 million ounces. That's 47% decline in 14 months. At current drainage rates, registered silver falls below 30 million ounces by June 2026, just 2 weeks of global consumption. The Basel III squeeze. Basel III eliminated fractional reserve escape routes banks used for precious metals obligations. Previously, banks could lease silver to meet delivery requirements. Basel III classified these as risky loans requiring capital reserves. Banks can no longer easily borrow metals to cover delivery obligations. They need ownership or must refuse commitments. South Korean banks stopped selling because continued sales without guaranteed supply violated Basel III regulations. The China export chokehold. January 1st, 2026. 12 days away. China implements export licensing for silver. Only 20 approved companies can export, minimum 80 tons annually. China produces 3,600 tons annually, but consumes 5,200 tons domestically. They import 1,600 tons to meet demand. New restrictions remove Chinese silver from global markets. Shanghai inventories. 715 tons remaining, down from 5,000 tons in 2020. Chinese authorities are draining stockpiles while preparing export barriers. The industrial demand explosion. Solar panels require specific silver paste for electrical conductivity. No substitute matches silver's properties at microscopic scale. Every crystalline silicon panel locks 13 to 22 milligrams for 25 years. Global installations require 230 million ounces annually, up from 85 million in 2020. Samsung's solid-state battery technology uses 50 to 500 grams of silver per electric vehicle, versus virtually none in traditional lithium-ion batteries. As automakers transition for improved safety and charging speeds, automotive silver demand could quadruple within 5 years. 5G infrastructure, medical devices, and AI data centers all increase consumption exponentially. These aren't speculative demands that disappear during recessions. These are structural technological shifts continuing regardless of economic conditions. The banking calculation. When multiple banks simultaneously restrict silver access, they're responding to shared intelligence about supply constraints. Banking risk management indicates high probability of delivery failures. February 14th coordinated restrictions suggest shared intelligence about Chinese export policies and COMEX depletion. Banks positioned ahead of public awareness to avoid unfulfillable obligations. Swiss refiners demanding extended payments. Indian banks rationing sales. Australian institutions limiting quantities. Each represents acknowledgement that supply chains are breaking. Banks are preparing for systematic supply failure. When banks prepare for supply failure in monetary metals, violent price appreciation follows with mathematical certainty. January 1st, 2026. China's export restrictions take effect in 12 days. The window for physical silver acquisition at reasonable premiums is closing faster than most investors realize. When Chinese supply disappears from global markets and COMEX inventories fall below critical thresholds, the paper market breaks. History shows what happens next. Not speculation, historical fact documented across multiple commodity crises. When institutions can't deliver physical assets to fulfill paper promises, prices don't rise gradually. They gap violently higher until new equilibrium establishes between available supply and desperate demand. The Hunt brothers pushed silver from $6 to $49 in 18 months, using leverage and borrowed money. Today's industrial demand represents structural consumption that can't be liquidated or reversed. Solar panel manufacturers, electric vehicle companies, and data center operators will pay any price for reliable silver supply, because their entire business models depend on technological infrastructure requiring silver inputs. South Korean banks stop selling silver because they see what's coming. Swiss refiners altered century-old payment terms for the same reason. When institutions with unlimited capital and global supply connections restrict access to a monetary metal, they're not protecting customers from volatility. They're protecting themselves from delivery failures that would destroy their credibility and trigger massive legal liability. The banking blackout on silver sales isn't temporary market disruption. It's institutional acknowledgement that paper promises can no longer be reliably converted to physical metal. Your choice. Position before the institutional panic becomes public knowledge, or explain later why you ignored the clearest supply crisis signal in precious metals history. The banks have already made their decision. The question is whether you'll make yours before January 1st changes everything. Because when the paper silver market finally breaks, and every historical precedent suggests it will, there won't be a second chance to acquire physical metal at these prices. The institutions know this. The data confirms it. The only question remaining is whether you'll act on pattern recognition or wait for mainstream confirmation that always comes too late.